All right, topping the news this hour, it's a scene millions around the world have watched unfold. A moment in history captured on cell phone cameras and through eyewitness accounts on Twitter. For many, the Arab Spring was a total upset of the past decade's policies in the Middle East. Government officials looked at the protests with an air of skepticism, many others with a glimmer of hope for what peaceful rallies can accomplish. We watched as the protests flared up, toppled governments, and then died down. But now, in light of an anti-Muslim film entitled The Innocence of Muslims, dozens of protests have broken out across the region. This time, the unrest isn't focused on each individual country's government, but against the U.S. Here's a map highlighting some of the regions we know of: Gaza City, Tripoli, Cairo, Benghazi, Bangladesh, Baghdad, Jerusalem, Sana'a, Islamabad, Tunis, Kuala Lumpur, Tehran, Kabul, Khartoum, Kuwait City, Algiers, Saleh, Jalalabad, Karachi, Lahore, and Berlin. And that's just to name a few. For the very latest on the unrest in the Middle East, RT correspondent Paula Sleer is in Cairo. Hi there, Paula. So you're on the ground right now. Can you describe the climate for me today?
Well, it's about 10 o'clock this evening local time, and there's this heavy presence of mostly youngsters that have been on the streets since the early hours of this morning. I was caught up in that demonstration on my way to this live position. They're burning tires, they've sealed off parts of the road, and these are all the roads that surround the American embassy here in Cairo, and essentially they're holding a standoff with the security forces. Now, throughout the day, they've been hurling large chunks of concrete, stones and shards of glass at these security officers. They in turn have erected a security barrier that separates the protesters from the police officers, and every so often you have the police firing rounds of tear gas. And I've spent most of the day feeling the sting of that tear gas. It's very, very strong, and that's why we have seen people here being rushed to hospital every couple of minutes. Even now you're hearing ambulances rushing past. We're also hearing reports of the first person who has been killed in this latest round of unrest here in Egypt.
And Paula, I understand you couldn't leave your hotel for a period of time. You kind of touched on that a little bit, but can you go into detail of what was happening then?
Well, that's right. I mean, the scenes here, to some extent, are reminiscent of the Arab Spring and what it was like here when I was here last year. The internet has gone down in several areas, and as a result, the communication is very, very difficult. And this is largely because of the overload of people in one specific area. I was caught in the hotel where the hotel staff had actually barricaded the doors and the windows and were frightened to let any people out. So on the one hand, you had this bizarre scenario of people who needed to catch planes, who needed to get to the airport, and they were simply barricaded inside the hotel. I'm not quite sure if this is making it into the mainstream media, but there has been a lot of looting here in Cairo, all the shops and the businesses around these hotels, and I'm talking now in the vicinity where I'm standing, which is essentially not far from the American embassy here in Cairo. There has been a lot of looting, there's a lot of lawlessness, you have these youngsters just running amok. Speaking to some people here, there is the feeling that this isn't necessarily a revolution, certainly not the same kind of excitement that there was in some quarters. It's little more than a year and a half ago. But what you're feeling today on the streets of Cairo is anger, is frustration, but there is certainly an element of criminality in all of this.
And Paula, I know that President Mohamed Morsi has come out and actually spoken out against these protests. Can you talk a little bit about that? I mean, he said that something to the extent of that these people are guests, that these protests are not necessary. Can you comment on that?
Well, it's been interesting watching the Muslim Brotherhood deal with this. Of course, the violence today is the first real spate of violence that the new Egyptian President Mohamed Morsi has had to deal with since he took the presidency. He is currently in Europe, where he's trying to shore up investment pledges, and so far he has managed to get some 1 billion pledges put forward for Egypt, but there is a lot of criticism for him here back at home, saying this is a very real crisis. Why isn't he here, and why isn't he dealing immediately with the situation on the ground? Earlier on Friday, the Muslim Brotherhood did call for nationwide strikes to protest against this American-based anti-Muslim film, but later in the day they withdrew that call and said there needed to be smaller, more symbolic protests. That message has not filtered down to the street, and certainly the Muslim Brotherhood is taking a back step. When you see the anger and the frustration and you talk to the protesters here in Cairo, they don't really care what the Muslim Brotherhood is saying vis-a-vis take to the streets. They are angry. It's doubtful, of course, how many of them have actually seen the video, but certainly they've heard enough about it to make them go to the streets.
And Paula, I know that there was a lot of questions over the Muslim Brotherhood taking over in Egypt, and I guess what you're saying is that, you know, they are even trying to calm it down, these anti-Muslim or anti-America protests, and they're not even able to quell it themselves.
Well, certainly the Muslim Brotherhood, and here we're talking also about the Egyptian President Mohamed Morsi, is walking a very fine line. You have seen a lot of countries withdraw investments or at least sit on the fence, waiting to see what develops here in the country and whether or not they'll continue to lend financial assistance and other kind of support to Egypt. Then at the same time, you have the Brotherhood trying to keep these neighbors happy, but certainly it doesn't want to lose grassroots support. And at the moment, that grassroots support is very, very much anti the United States. So they're having to tread this very, very fine line. Looking at the profile of protesters on the streets, there isn't necessarily a strong Muslim Brotherhood presence. Certainly I did notice that when Morsi was elected, and in the last few months of unrest here in Egypt, there has been a Brotherhood presence and a Brotherhood face to the protests. I haven't noticed that specifically today, looking around at the demonstrators. I would say that mostly they're youngsters. You do get a sense of people taking to the streets that for some of them, they are angry, but certainly for some of them, it's also just something to do, to pick up some stones, to pick up some rocks and to hurl them at police. And we are seeing scenes that are reminiscent of the kind of violence that has plagued this country for the last year and a half or so.
And Paula, from what you are seeing, would you consider these protests to be simply anti-America or just the anti this film? Is this speaking to a larger narrative here?
At this moment, I would say the protests are anti-America. They are very specifically geared towards this movie, although, as I say, there is this element of criminality and just lawlessness amongst them. The question, of course, is what will happen to these protests moving forward? And here, what's particularly worrying is that we've seen the growth, the almost spiraling out of control that these protests have happened. You mentioned earlier in your intro that we are seeing protests now in Afghanistan. We're seeing them in Lebanon, where at least one person has been killed and several dozen were injured. We're witnessing similar as such protests even in northern Sinai, where there was an attack on a multinational security force there, with 4 multinational security force keepers being injured and the Al-Qaeda flag being held up. The latest that's coming out of Libya, and of course this is where the first person was killed related to the violence linked to this movie, and that was the American ambassador on Tuesday. The latest there is that an investigation is underway and that both the United States as well as the Libyan authorities are pointing fingers towards Al-Qaeda, and we have seen Al-Qaeda flags popping up at various other demonstrations throughout the region. So the question is whether or not these demonstrations can be contained or whether or not they'll lead to something much more far-reaching. And I certainly can give you a sense from the mood on the ground, and that is that these demonstrations seem far from likely to quell or to stop anytime soon. If anything, they seem to be intensifying in their violence.
And Paula, I know that Egypt has actually banned YouTube for an indefinite amount of time in order to try to prevent people from watching this film. We're going to have to see how this plays out in the coming days. RT correspondent Paula Sleer, please keep us updated.